Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm president of the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad you're able to join us tonight for what promises to be a very, very special evening. Matthew Harris Jouett, who was born in 1788 and died in 1827, his life and his work by Estill Pennington. For the past 40 years, Estill Pennington, known around Bourbon County as Buck Pennington, has sought to elevate the profile of Kentucky's cultural and intellectual history through a series of publications. It's a remarkable body of life's work, which include William Edward West, Kentucky Painter, and Kentucky, the Master Painters, which I'm showing you here. Going from the frontier days to the Great Depression. And then Lessons in Likeness, which I have here. The Portrait Painter in Kentucky and Ohio River Valley, 1800 to 1920, as well as catalogs in private collections and essays in one of my favorite books, which I highly recommend for anybody interested in Kentucky culture and history, Bluegrass Renaissance, the History and Culture of Central Kentucky, 1792 to 1852. Now, his lecture tonight is based on the heaviest and the thickest of the books, Matthew Harris Jouett, 1788 to 1827, his life and his work. All of these books are at the Filson in our library, but I recommend them for anybody who wants a complete, thorough introduction to Kentucky material culture and portraiture, along with works by William Floyd and some others. But these are particularly important, and they're refreshingly easy to read and quite beautiful. Though he's lived in Washington, London, and Amsterdam, Buck still loves the rolling fields of bluegrass in Bourbon County, Kentucky, where he was born and to which he has returned. Now, I'll return to moderate questions after this presentation as time permits. But right now, if you would, please join me in welcoming a Kentucky treasure, Estill Pennington.
I would like to thank the Filson Historical Society for inviting me to lecture on Matthew Harris Jouett this evening. And I would like to express my gratitude for the research materials I was able to use in their library. I would also like to dedicate my lecture to Judy Miller, formerly of the Filson, who has retired, for the guidance and love she has given to so many of us over the years. Now, I think I go to share screen. Matthew Harris Jouett and the Art of Portraiture in the West. In Kentucky, the story of Matthew Harris Jouett is quite well known. He was born in a manger in Boyle County, Kentucky, to a woman who had quite a regal presence and a fella who was a regular chap. He showed a great deal of talent at an early age and was sent to one of the finest art academies in the world, where he studied with some old guy who was a famous painter. When he finished his studies, he went on to paint the Mona Lisa, Washington Crossing the Delaware, American Gothic, and he was just beginning to have an experimental period when he died. But he was taken up into heaven by a spaceship, where he currently abides with Elvis Presley, singing duets of Kentucky Rain Keeps Falling Down. Now, none of that is true. And that was supposed to be your little Anglican homily joke to begin the process. But it is a reflection of the extent to which so many myths and rumors and misattributions have attached themselves to Matthew Harris Jouett's life. He was indeed born in Kentucky and spent his formative years, early years, here at the lovely Jack Jewett house in Woodford County. In the process of working on Matthew Harris Jouett, his life and works, I was blessed to have the sponsorship of Historic Parish, Bourbon County, Kentucky, who provided me a shelter, 501c3 shelter for charitable giving and helped me reach my goals. In order to pursue Matthew Harris Jouett's life and career, I worked in several of the major research sites and of course found things online. Matthew Harris Jouett's work was recorded by his grandson, Jewett Menifee, lower left. It was then published in the book that our beloved friend at the Filson did, the wonderful Old Masters of the Bluegrass by Samuel Woodson Price. And what you're looking at here are, on the left is the gallery, the library at the National Portrait Gallery where I worked and studied. And on the lower right is the reading room at the Frick Art Reference Library. So I've spent 6 years at this, gleaning as much information, making as an extensive record as I could of his work. Jewett began his life and career in his student days at Transylvania University, a drawing of which attributed to him is on the right. Of course, I've always been rather amused by the title of our book, Bluegrass Renaissance, because that implies a rebirth. What was the first round? I guess we don't know. But Jewett came of age in Lexington, Kentucky, at a time of tremendous cultural growth and awareness. One of the things I was asked to do by my old professor and frequent introducer, Dr. Ellen Miles from the Portrait Gallery, was to set the stage. And the Lexington, at the time of Jewett's early career in life, there were bookstores, there was theater, there were silversmiths and cabinet makers. It was quite the place. It was called the Athens of the West. And there was a great deal going on. Present in Louisville during those days was the painter George Beck, who was teaching at Transy and also Transylvania, and also conducting art classes. On the left is a landscape he did, and on the right, a miniature of George Washington. Very early on, Matt seems to have decided to become a portrait painter. Now, deciding to become a portrait painter is right up there with deciding to become an art historian, because what do? You know, how are you going to make it in the world? But Jewett was determined, and he had some native talent for drawing. His early portraits, as in the case of Thomas Hart IV, reflect his knowledge of American print sources. On the right, Stewart's Washington by Holloway. And the use of print sources is something many artists did. His early works they vary between being rather charming, as in the case of Alexander Fraser, and rather awkwardly ambitious, as in the case of James Burney Marshall, who is listening to a TikTok there. When the War of 1812 broke out, Jewett joined up and was at the site of the River Raisin, not at the battle, but at the site and in that neighborhood. And in the course of the war, he was a paymaster, and he managed to lose a group of vouchers for which he felt responsible, and he spent the rest of his life endeavoring to pay the government back for them, which it says speaks volumes about his integrity, but was definitely a burden he carried with him. Jewett was a product of a society in which honor meant a great deal. I recommend to you my old colleague Bertram Wyatt Brown's book called Southern Honor, in which he looks at how that shaped forces and shaped the culture of the age. When the war was over, he decided to go east for further study. And his question was whether to go to Philadelphia and work with Thomas Sully, or Boston and work with Gilbert Stuart. He went to Philadelphia in search of the West Boys, William Edward and John E., in order to help him understand, and actually was advised to go on to Stuart. Sully and Stuart represent the two emerging dichotomy in early American portrait art. Sully is romantic, foppish, sprawling, somewhat distracted, diverse color and conflicting gaze. Gilbert Stuart's work is erect, bewigged, has a penetrating gaze, equal color and harmonic lines. Although these are both painted in 1810, by the way. Although in more simple terms, I like to say that the difference between the federal era and the Romantic era is that the Federalists would have said, "Here I am," as we see in the portrait by Stuart on the right. And that the Romantic era, the question would have been, "Who am I?" So you go from this great assured knowledge that guided the founding of the country to this romantic notion of what's out there in the world. When he got to Boston, Gilbert Stuart, after all, we're talking 1816 here, and Gilbert Stuart is quite old, quite past his time, but Matthew Harris Jouett kept a journal of their encounter, which is one of the rare documents of American art history. It's quite rare to have a manuscript in which it's been reported what he was taught. And of course, one of the lines that everyone loves is that when he walked into Gilbert Stuart's studio, Stuart said, "Be quick, for I have no time for chat, Kentucky boatman." So I guess the flatboat myth was already underway. It's important that we understand what Gilbert Stuart taught. In the course of working on this book, I transcribed the entire handwritten manuscript and annotated it so that we would have it for the future. Very importantly, Stuart taught, set the head, then paint, don't draw. Here are two examples of that by Stuart, where you're working from the head out. He said it was a waste of time to draw. Suggesting many artists would take crayon or charcoal or a pencil and draw on the canvas and then fill it in with color. Stuart worked completely a la prima. In other words, he held the palette, he took the brush, he carried the paint from there and went about it. I like to show these images also because I'm always at war with that myth that artists went around with canvases that had no heads. And when they got there, would you like your head on this body? It's far more likely that they began with the head, as we see here with John Bill Ricketts, moved on from there. Stuart advised to keep the subject erect and elevated, equal color, equal effect, and to cherish the skin tones. We see here probably just not the best slide, but a little blushing Dolly Madison, and then the wonderful complexion in Anne Nancy Pennington from Pennington, New Jersey, there on the right, holding, by the way, you will note, a little miniature silhouette. Stuart said to carefully consider the character of your subject and consult truth rather than fancy. You know, in the 1780s, he was hired by the Washingtons to paint their portraits. This is as far as he ever got. They were done from life sittings, but he never finished them and he never returned them. He kept them. So when Matthew Harris Jouett got to Boston, I found documentation that they were sitting on the floor of the house, leaning up against the wall. So he was able to study, particularly the Washington, which Stuart gave him permission to copy several times. One of the most, I think, creative things that Stuart taught Matthew Harris Jouett was to mix spirits of turpentine with lead white to create a standing white. If you beat turpentine into lead white and apply it as what they would have called a mayonnaise, the turpentine will evaporate and you'll be left with what we see here in the marvelous portrait of Abigail Adams, all this beautiful frothy lace standing up in relief. Stuart's greatest achievement, and I really think one of the greatest achievements of any portrait painter, is moment, gaze. A portrait artist captures a particular moment, and the subject in the portrait is looking back at us for all time, and we are beholding them. Here we have Samuel Gates and his wife, Mrs. Gates. No, that's not the lady from The Wizard of Oz who played the Wicked Witch of the Whichever Direction, but it does kind of look like her. And if you'll look at that string where she's doing some sewing, that's one of the tightest drawn pieces of thread you might ever see. The federal neoclassical mentality is informed, engaged, and aware. And that's what Jewett learned and admired, and that's what he took back with him to the bluegrass and point south when he began his career in 1817, 1818. I'll show you here just some typical slides of central Kentucky. One of the first people when he got back that he painted was Henry Clay. I was able to find the documentation on the first one of these he did. He copied several, but here in the Clay portrait, he's realized what Stuart told him might be his greatest accomplishment, and that is his brilliance with color and flesh tones. I love this portrait of Henry Clay because the longer you look at it, the more you begin to understand that he's looking out at you with a certain, I don't want to say smirk or arrogance, but that could be it. He's on his guard, and he's putting you on your guard to a certain extent. After he got back, he also made several copies of works by Stuart, notably the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson portraits. There's one of the Jefferson portraits at the Speed Museum from the No collection. In the Filson collection, there's this image of Peter Grayson, which shows you how Matthew Harris Jouett painted with and drew with the brush and not with a pencil because of the sketchy quality there. We can see that Jewett very faithfully learned and followed the Stuart formula. Stuart's portrait of Admiral Chauncey on the left and Jewett's portrait of Porter on the right show great similarities. There's Peter Bell Porter's wife, Letitia Breckenridge, in another sort of Stuart mood. Stuart's portrait of Reverend Buckminster and Jewett's portrait of Todd both show an affinity for a certain neoclassical architectonic setting. Stuart's image of Mrs. Parkman in her bonnet and Mrs. Bibb in her bonnet also reflect an ongoing influence. I consider that Jewett had several approaches to character. The man of distinction, John Brown on the left, and Mr. Postlethwaite on the right. The matron in the headdress, the woman on the left, Mrs. Meredith, with her elaborate hat, and the woman on the right. All of this, by the way, reminds us of this business of Mark Twain having said, if the world comes to an end, I want to be in Kentucky because they're always 20 years behind. So here we have women dressing in the federal style at the high point of the Romantic movement, and Jewett painting them accordingly. The woman on the right has a paisley shawl that it has been said there was only one of, and Jewett borrowed it from the original owner and took it around with him and used it in other portraits. I don't think that's true for the reasons of logistic, if nothing else. The young woman with the fringe, where you have the kind of curled hair turned to one side, and the rather fancy young man on the left, the wonderful portrait of Taylor that's at the Speed Museum, looking more than a little cocky there and drawing our attention. Jewett worked in the Deep South. He worked in New Orleans. He painted several New Orleans grandees in the Sennett family and the owner of Destrehan Plantation. Some of his work there comes back to the whole issue of who painted what. And the portrait on the right is a Jewett and has long been attributed to Jewett. And I feel that actually the portrait on the left is by his chess master and chess partner at the Napoleon House. See, there's the Napoleon House where he played chess, and that's John Wesley Jarvis. I did make some discoveries in New Orleans by poking around in the basement of the Louisiana State Museum and the storeroom of the Historic New Orleans Collection. Now, asking questions, by which I mean Jewett asking questions. In the mid-1820s, Jewett had a very dear friend named Lawrence Levy that he visited with a great deal in New Orleans. Part of why it was so exciting to work on these is that I went to Chicago to look at the letters that were exchanged between Lawrence Levy and Matthew Harris Jouett. You may or may not recall that large portions of the Durrett collection were sold to the University of Chicago, so they're not in Louisville at the Filson. After his death, Jewett set about to paint this version of Carracci's Three Marys, a monumental attempt that he based on a print source, undoubtedly, and a painting which really continues to intrigue me. Yes, it's a copy, but the coloration is Jewett's. I feel he was assisted by John Grimes in the process, who was already his assistant, but it is a very unusual painting. It's enormous, and it's currently at the Speed, having been carefully restored by a group in Cleveland and on long-term display. It is the property of the Archdiocese of Louisville, who has had it for many years. That gives you a chance to really look at the color and facial expressions. Jewett's next major commission was to paint the Marquis de Lafayette when he came to Lexington in 1825 on his farewell tour to America, and stopped in Lexington and was elaborately entertained, and Jewett was asked to paint his portrait. He based it on a painting by the Dutch Romantic artist Eric Scheffer, with some changes. He set Lafayette in a park that he drew inspiration from Washington's theme, Washington's tomb, whereas Scheffer has Lafayette against a Romantic background Here we have Lafayette against an atmospheric background. It was hung in the old Capitol, where it remains to this day. Jewett did have a live sitting with Lafayette in September of 1825 and reproduced several head and shoulders portraits. Towards the end of his career, we have to ask what would be his end of his career. We have to ask if he was going through a stylistic change. Was he really going to move into Romanticism? The lady on the left with her vivid coloration and her garb is very much in an experimental mood. The marvelous portrait of the young archbard Logan with an almost impressionistic background. Jewett was coming home from Louisville, stopped to water his horse, probably at a familiar site in Shelby County, drank the water, and developed something called bilious fever and died. So many of them died from drinking the water. After his death, a troubled and confused legacy ensued. In 1876, the Philadelphia Centennial took note of him, and his grandson published a list. In 1892, Charles Henry Hart, who was a New York art dealer, got in touch with Sarah Jewett Menifee, borrowed materials from her, and when she died, he never returned them. He kept the actual diary of having painted with Gilbert Stuart, which to this day has not been found. The source for all of us is a photocopy made in the 30s by a dealer collector in New York. In 1910, Elizabeth Martin began to make lists and covertly market Jewett paintings to Macbeth Gallery in New York, and non-Jewetts began to enter public collections. In 1938, Jonas published his book on Jewett, commissioned by Hattie Speed, which had multiple errors, challenged by Judge Samuel Wilson. Elizabeth Martin published her catalog of all known paintings, which subsequent writers like Edna Talbot Whitley and Floyd did not like and ducked the issue. The result is over 500 paintings attributed to an artist who may have painted some 325. There are Jewetts that are floating around. On the left is a painting attributed to Jewett online by a website that proclaims, "Let us authenticate your paintings." On the right, there's a portrait by Jewett's niece of Jewett's brother, painted very late in the 19th century, which is not a work by Jewett. In asking what is the character of his achievement, I feel it's based on Jewett's grasp of character, his abilities as a colorist, his spontaneity and the intensity of his standing white, and moment in gaze. Here is where he really, I think, captures Henry Clay, who Henry Clay does remain a very serious idol of mine. He occupies such an interesting place in our history, and it's ongoing. The beautiful little study of the Mitchell children with the different shadings of color. The wonderful brushwork of the standing white, where you can really see, now this is where we can properly use the word bravura to describe his technique. And his grasp of character. The Wiesigers, Daniel Wiesiger and Lucy Wiesiger, who had a very important tavern, and taverns in those days were more like courthouses and important gathering places. They are also the ancestors of several Kentucky political families and notables, not the least of whom is Libby Lloyd Jones. And here, in two of my favorites, the one of Rebecca, his sister-in-law, and the wonderful one of Trimble, the officer on the right, where we're truly engaged and riveted by these people. One of the things that has so frequently been quoted, much to my chagrin, is Samuel Woodson Price's relating that Matthew Harris Jewett's father, Jack Jewett, a kind of blowhard Revolutionary War hero of sorts, called the Paul Revere of the South, because he rode off to warn Jefferson that the British were coming, said, "I sent Matthew to college to become a gentleman, and he became nothing but a damn sign painter." Well, that's always been told in a kind of Jimmy crack corn and I don't care. Isn't that funny? Slap your leg, slap your knee. But it's not funny. Matthew Harris Jouett was always a gentleman and a portraitist. He was never a sign painter. And above all, I think in working on Matthew Harris Jouett, I came to fully embrace what I had already intimated. Celebrate his craft and cherish his creativity. Thank you.
Get started with the Q&A. First, I think what I would, and I would like anyone who wants to just put in some questions. And I know that we have several that were received in advance of this lecture. So if you would, staff, put those in as well. If you look at Kentucky's greatest antebellum portrait painters, who would you include in that pantheon, Buck?
Well, there was a rather amazing group of people working as portrait artists in Kentucky in that era, not the least of whom, of course, was William Edward West, which was my first topic. And another one would have been, of course, Oliver Frazier, John Grimes, some of the lesser known painters, like the one who worked here in Bourbon County, Edward Ford. And there was an abundance because partly, I think, because there was a demand. I just saw a question that popped up on the screen by someone named Emily Bingham that said something about the financial situation and how do they make their way. When Jewett came back from Philadelphia, he started charging $50 a portrait and made a very good living. But at the same time, he was paying back that debt to the federal government for the vouchers. So he was somewhat strapped. His wife's family had a farm. They lived on the farm. They had, his wife ran the farm while he was off as an itinerant. He'd leave in January and come back 9 months later, just in time for the birth of a child. And he had 9 children. So there was a certain rhythm there. Okay.
Here's a good question, and all of these look good. Were all of Jewett's portraits from live sittings with the subjects? And to add to that, how many sittings would it take to do a portrait?
Of course, Lafayette did finally sit to Jewett, but the full length was a copy from a print. But 99% of the rest of his sitters sat to him, and it would not have been long. He worked like Stuart a la prima, working from the head out, and I would say no more than 2 or 3 days to do what in the language of that era was called set the head. He would set the head, and then he would work out to finish the anatomical details and the background.
Another question. Were all of Jewett's portraits from live sittings? And you've answered that, I think. Did he paint General Samuel Hopkins, William Starling, or Judge Samuel McDowell? This is from Robert Gang. who is a fourth great grandson of Thomas Todd. If you,
Do you have those names? You have those names.
yeah, General Samuel Hopkins.
Believe it or not, I don't have my book here by me, but
So
if
you can always come back to that, or you could just send Robert Gang an email.
okay, what is his name?
Robert Gang, Gang, and we can get you his email address.
And who were the subjects?
General Samuel Hopkins, Colonel William Starling, Judge Samuel McDowell.
Well, I know he painted members of the Starling and McDowell families. If you'll get me that in an email form, I'll be glad to answer.
Excellent. This is interesting. How accurately did Jewett reflect his time, the times in which he lived, in which he painted?
Oh, I think there's a tremendous irony there, because I think he deeply reflected his time. He painted in the neoclassical manner, so he subscribed to a "here I am" presence, but his letters and his approach to gaze do affirm, who am I? Who am I? What is my role in this world? What is my place? And in his letters, he talks about his questions. He talks about being torn between family life and having a good time with the boys when he's in New Orleans. And he says something to the effect of, I chill in the tropics, and you know, he has a lot of questions about who he is, and those marvelous letters to Lawrence Levy really do answer that. So I think, in the sense of having a sort of romantic mentality, he's very much of his time, and very much of his time in Kentucky, because this comes back to one of the central themes in Kentucky history and culture. And that was the importance of Kentucky in the first half of the 19th century. The home of the westward moving pioneer, the home of the most important senator in the United States Senate, a place of great prosperity, a place of conflict. Who am I? The romantic question, in that the abolition question and the slave question was being fought out very intensely right here in Kentucky, because of people like Barton Stone at Cane Ridge, and like Colonel Henry Clay from Bourbon County, who was the president of the Abolition Convention in 1848. So there's a great seething consciousness, and I think Jewett was very much a part of that.
But let's go back to this question of who am I? Why would a sitter have wanted his or her portrait painted? How much did it cost, and who could have afforded it in these days before photography? And what statements were being made by the sitters? Were they the high and mighty? Were they people trying to be high and mighty, or wanting to be considered as upwardly mobile, so to speak? What accounts for this burst of portraiture in Kentucky, but also not just in Kentucky, but across what was then the United States?
Gosh, that's a lot.
I know.
I'll begin by saying
that means I did not have the succinctness of the questions that
No,
from the chat room.
Now, could you reform that
Yeah,
as a
that sounds
multiple
like me
choice, as
that
a
sounds
multiple
like-
choice exam?
Yeah, that's
by the way, this is
cross-examining a witness. I apologize, but go on.
no. This is a fun thing to share. Only once in the reign of a monarch in England is the term high and mighty used, and that's where it comes from. Is that the College of Heralds, the spokesman for the College of Heralds, comes out on the balcony at St. James's Palace and says, "Where God has chosen to call the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary." So there's your source there. Portraiture, there was a vogue for portraiture. There was a demand for portraiture because of likeness, because of wanting to preserve a likeness. I think it was a status symbol, I suppose. I get on very weak ground when I start looking at what Gerald Reitlinger called the economics of art. As far as who could afford it, like I said earlier, Jewett started out charging $50 a head, which is a pretty good chunk of change. But you have to ask yourself, if you wanted your portrait painted, would you save up? Would you make sacrifices? Jewett did paint large members of a wealthy establishment. And Tom Eblin, in his book, in his afterwards to my book on Jewett, says one of the values of the book and one of the values of Jewett is that he's left us images of this class of people, whatever issues we may have with them. It's like what Churchill says about monarchy: it puts a face on democracy. And so it is with portraiture. It gives us faces of these peoples and identities. It gives historians illustrations for their books. And so I think it's a very, very complex issue. And the world, but of course, portraiture disappeared almost overnight, because once photography came in, goodbye. And of course, photography was considerably cheaper. So you get a lot more images.
Another question, and this one is much more practical. Where would artists get their canvas and oil paints at the time? Were they produced in the United States or were they imported?
Oh, that's a lovely question that I like to answer, since I started my career at the National Portrait Gallery, and that was a very important issue for us. There were actually art supply stores in Lexington in Jewett's lifetime. And you have to remember that Jewett is painting before tube paints. So he's doing what I like to call grind and bind. He's buying pigments and binding them with either turpentine, binding them with a medium, binding them with some form of oil and applying them. The canvases are coming from Philadelphia, and they are a coarse weave linen that you would then prepare by coating it with something that we call rabbit glue. It's a gesso, and you would size the canvas. You would take the canvas, you would stretch it, you would size it, and then you begin to paint upon it. I consider myself so fortunate to have spent time in the conservation lab at the National Portrait Gallery, watching the whole process from beginning on, seeing how the canvas was prepared, seeing how the painter started, because in those days, the study of art was also the study of the craft of art, because it was important that you knew how a work was made as well as there it is. And of course, in a snotty way, we used to like to say, we study art, not from slides, but that makes a difference.
I know that some portraits in early Kentucky were painted on wood as opposed to canvas. What was the reason? And if you could put a percentage on each, what would it be?
Painted on panel
Yeah.
We call that panel. And in Jewett's case, the panel would frequently be cradled with a piece at the top or the bottom. And to answer your question, now those panels were also available in paint stores. And there was a paint store right in downtown Lexington. That's where Jewett met Grimes. And the panels would have been available. I didn't really do a quantitative analysis of that, but you have to think that you're going to paint on panel when you're stationary in your studio, and when you're out as an itinerant, you might be more likely to paint on canvas unless you find panel in the locale, either in Natchez or New Orleans. I did not. That's a good question.
There are a lot of good imponderable questions. Did Jewett teach painting? And if so, who were his students?
That's an excellent question too, because we think of teaching as something that might occur in a classroom. Whereas when you talk about studying art, especially in the 18th century traditions of the Royal Academy and Joshua Reynolds, you're talking about a live organic process. You're talking about observing a painter paint. You're talking about observing a painter grind and bind. You're talking about learning up close. And I always think back, I've always thought it was important that I try to paint and draw. I don't do either one of them very well, but I did take some studio classes when I was in Athens, Georgia in graduate school, and I worked with a painter named Chatham Murray, and she would come over and say, do this. And she'd take the brush and all of a sudden she'd turn my perspective inside out. So John Grimes worked very closely with Jewett and might be considered a student. Other than that, I can't really think of anybody that would have been a student. He was too young. Now he himself was always considered to be Stuart's favorite pupil. And Stuart definitely taught in the studio manner, where you're observing, you're not taking notes.
Why, starting in the late 19th century, is it that Jewett becomes Kentucky's singularly celebrated portrait painter, while others, such as Grimes, are left in relative obscurity?
And Bradford and Asa Park. And that's why you have 500 Jewetts and 6 Asa Parks. Well, I can answer that from my perspective. And I think an awful lot can be laid at the feet of the colonial revival. And the colonial revival began with the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876. And thereafter, the founding of all of these organizations, the Sons and Daughters of Revolutionary War Buck Privates, for example, or the Colonial Dames, or the DAR, or all of these things that venerated genealogy. There's been an enormous study of that. And one of the things that we've often discussed in Bourbon County is that every one of them either walked or came out here on a wagon. They got off the wagon, they sat down. The first night was probably pretty scary, but suddenly before long, within the next generation, they were actually English gentry. and I think that's what's very much at play with Matthew Harris Jouett. Matthew Harris Jouett came to national attention through a series of articles Charles Henry Hart wrote. So in an era in which historic American portraiture was being, and English portraiture was being collected like crazy, here was a name. Oh, I've got a Jewett. Oh, there's a Jewett in my family. Oh, I've got a Jewett. I'm sure it is. It was painted in 1837. Oh, I say, how nice. 10 years after he died. It's one of those posthumous Jewetts. They're really good. Never forget, the most expensive painting, if you translate it in today's terms, the most expensive portrait ever sold is a portrait. And it's the painting ever sold is a portrait, and it's the Blue Boy at the Huntington. Samuel Huntington paid more than $100 million in today's terms. So there was quite a vogue. And I think, as I say in my introduction, Jewett became an illustrative example of turning a frontier society into a venerable golden age. And it was just the thing. And, you know, growing up, I would have heard that, oh, I have a Jewett, or, oh, there's a Jewett. So there was a certain chicness to it that, and by the way, this is a good time to say, that's not the reason to admire Jewett, that it gives you some kind of elite object in your home. My love for Jewett is because of his craft and because of his grasp of character. But there is no doubt that he was the poster boy for a lot of grand ambitions in his time. And the others just weren't known. I mean, you know, not a lot of things are signed, and the reasons they aren't signed is that you didn't, you didn't sign things because unless you were asked to. It was just not a tradition in the arts until long after the Civil War. And so nobody knew these other painters. And I tell you what, Alexander Bradford and Grimes, and all have their moments. They really do. There's some good work out there. The portrait that's on the cover of Lessons in Likeness is by a very interesting portrait artist from Maysville. I saw something pop up that said something about Jewett died at his home in Lexington, and where is he buried? Well, he was buried on the farm, but then his grandson dug him up and buried him in Louisville at Cave Hill. Now, why would someone who was an integral part of Central Kentucky want to be buried in Louisville? Where is Louisville? Is it in Indiana?
Now, wait, you're treading there on dangerous territory.
Oh, I know.
But I think the portrait to which you were referring is by Aaron Corwine. Is that right?
By Aaron Houghton Corwine.
Yeah. Who died tragically young too, but would be in that pantheon of great Kentucky portraitists.
They all died young. Jewett died young. Bradford died young. John Grimes died young. Corwine died young. That's part of the sort of melodramatic melancholy aspect of this whole episode.
What about this business of copying portraits? That is, say I inherit a portrait of my father at an early age, and then one of my sisters marries, but she would like a portrait of my father to hang in her dining room. And this would be before the days of photography. Was that something that happened with some degree of frequency?
Another tough question. It did happen. Now, I refer to multiples of the same subject in my book as variants. A copy, I really think of as being of a work by somebody else. But there were calls for multiples from families, and it did occur. What you see actually much later on, it's funny, what you see later on are photographs of portraits being blown up and hand colored. A lot of artists made their living by hand coloring those in later stages.
Here's a good question that goes along these lines. What is the most sensible way for a family with portraits long reputed in family oral history to be by Jewett? to find a reliable answer to whether this is correct or just lore?
Well, I always like it to make it perfectly clear that I did not base my work on waving magic wands. I did not go about like some people have done in Kentucky and say, oh, that's a Jewett, I can tell. I based authenticity. I began with literature. There are enough lists and enough reports of Jewett to come up with these a number of attributions to him. And then in terms of disputing, you know, there are subtleties of distinction between Jewett and several of his contemporaries. And then there are just bad portraits. And if you look at the Jewett book, you know, in the back, I have a disputed section and a section I didn't see. And I give my reasons for disputing them based on the literature. And I've had situations where someone says, oh, I've got a Jewett because there's a note on the back of it that says painted by Jewett. Well, was the note on the back of it applied during Jewett's lifetime? Or is it someone's colonial revival ancestor who I found that in several instances, who made that attribution and then is willing to stick by it. Now, I say in my book that the matter of Jewett attributions has been and will continue to be a dispute, and that's a disputed topic. It's something that exists in the imagination. I want a Jewett. I know this is my Jewett. And I say, what I have tried to do with my catalog is to provide you with much information as possible so that the study can go on. Because I feel that the best scholarship is not about reaching a destination. It's not about standing in the middle of the street and saying, real Jewetts to the left, fake Jewetts to the right. It's about paving the road. It's about keeping the study alive. Since my publication came out, 2 Jewetts have appeared that I didn't previously know. And I did have a record of 1 because it had been in the Clay family and a Clay descendant had it. So it just rang true. And the other one, fortunately, was signed in red crayon on the back, M.H. Jewett. And it was a portrait the family had always considered the old lady to be so ugly that for several generations, they kept her in the attic. And finally, I was able to see it and know that it wasn't Jewett.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to ask
well,
you.
Thank God.
Don't hang up yet. I'm going to ask you 2 very quick questions.
All right.
Because I think we have a very engaged audience tonight. What were the circumstances of Jewett's death?
Well, he drank bad water, and he got home and he began to run a fever. And within a day, he was out of his mind and sweating. And a day later, he died. Whether it was typhus, it was probably something like typhus or cholera. They called it bilious fever. But you know what that means. It means that he was stricken with dehydrating diarrhea and just killed him just like that, bless his heart.
Also, did he paint anything besides portraits? I think I'm aware of one that he painted of his home.
Right. He painted one of his home, and of course he painted the 3 Marys, which is not a portrait. But by and large, he was a portraitist. I mean, that was clearly his goal from the beginning. And so there aren't, it's not like other portrait artists who produce landscapes and history paintings. It's not like that.
And then lastly, and this is more general, but let's end it with this. You have vast experience at looking at portraits. What is it about a portrait that makes it to you significant, engaging, important, meaningful? What are the attributes of a great portrait, be it by Jewett, be it in Kentucky, be it in the United States, be it worldwide? What are the things that move you?
Well, once upon a time, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, some people from the Speed came up to have lunch at Hideaway with Sal. And they said, "Oh, Mrs. Hinkle, when he was a little boy, did you think he was really smart?" Which was embarrassing. And Sally said, "No, we just thought he asked a lot of questions." And I would go around, even as a small child with grandmother, and we'd go to these old houses in Bourbon County. Who's that? I was always fascinated to know who was on the wall. Who is that person? I think what makes a portrait attractive or engaging is gaze, is color. Of course, it helps if they're nice looking. I have a lot of portrait artists outside of the South and that or America that I admire a great deal. I'm a huge fan of Pompeo Battoni. I am a huge fan of John Singer Sargent and of his works. But it does always, for me, come back to moment and gaze. It does come back to the sitter engaging us from across time and space and distance to here I am. Here's a record of my life. This is strictly a personal note, but when the portrait gallery opened in 1968, I went to Washington not long after that, and I said, "I want to work here." And 4 years later, I was. So portraiture, I think, also represents to me a certain amount of stability and tradition that I cherish. I want to conclude by saying I don't know anything that I'm asking you to believe. We live in a time where everyone knows something, everyone has an opinion. I want to tell you this. I don't. I just want to share. I want to celebrate creativity. I want to celebrate and try to clear up some problems in the life and works of an artist that I greatly admire. And I think that can be part of the mindful process. Portraits are a manifestation of mindfulness. Now, can I conclude with one thing?
Yes.
I don't know whether this is proper or not, but I've kind of cobbled together a prayer from various scriptures, and I just want to share it with you. It's very brief. Oh Lord, let your loving kindness be upon them who put their trust in you. Give comfort to those who mourn. Give aid to those who suffer. Give love to those who call out your name. And may that peace which passeth all understanding abide with us now and remain with us always. Love each other, be good, cherish art, and bless you.
Thank you.
And don't come to Bourbon County without a visa.
I simply want to thank everyone who's participated in tonight's lecture for being with us. I'd like to thank this great Kentucky treasure, this raconteur, for his presentation. At the Filson, our mission is to collect, to preserve, and tell the stories of Kentucky history and the history of the Ohio River Valley. And Estill, Curtis, Pennington, you've done a marvelous job of helping us this evening with that mission. Thank you. Thank you all. Good night.